intervalo. Tiaços também merece algumas férias. Voltamos aqui em carga total. Com mais um querido convidado. Hoje a gente vai receber Greg Mogenson, um querido amigo, uma figura importante dentro do campo junguiano, dentro do campo da psicologia como disciplina da interioridade. Há algum tempo a gente estava querendo trazer o Greg, por causa de datas não conseguimos e finalmente agora tornou possível. E é um prazer recebê-lo, Greg. Vou te apresentar. Greg Mogenson, ele é psicoterapeuta, psicanalista junguiano, com prática clínica em London, Ontário, Canadá. Ele é membro fundador e ex-vice-presidente da Sociedade Internacional de Psicologia como disciplina da interioridade. Autor de numerosos artigos no campo da psicologia analítica, seus livros incluem Vicarious Animae, Afirmação Especulativa do Eu na Psicoterapia Junguiana, O Sonho da Psicologia do Tribunal, A Religião Mais Amaldiçoada, Quando um Trauma se Torna Deus, Saudando os Anjos, Uma Visão Imaginal do Processo de Luto, A Pomba no Consultório, Histeria e Ânima, em Christopher Bollas e Jung, Gnose do Norte, Thor, Balder e Volsung, no Pensamento de Freud e Jung, e com Wolfgang Giges e David Miller, Dialética e Psicologia Analítica, o Seminário de El Capitan Canyon. Greg também é autor de 3 outros ensaios na série de monografias da Sociedade Internacional de Psicologia como disciplina da interioridade. O Abandono do Dever e o Surgimento da Psicologia, conforme refletido no caso de Lord Jim, de Conrad, Aquele Vislumbre de Verdade que Você Esqueceu de Pedir, e, finalmente, Interiorizando o Cão de Hilke como divino em si mesmo. Esse é o último livro do Greg, Vicarious Animae, acho que é a publicação mais recente. Estou apenas trazendo aqui algumas capas dos livros. Esse livro é um livro fundamental, onde o Greg e o David Miller trabalham junto com Wolfgang Giges nos seminários El Capitan. Esse que é um livro muito interessante, né, Greg? Da mitologia nórdica, onde ele analisa a mitologia nórdica a partir do pensamento de Freud e de Jung. O meu preferido, a Pomba no Consultório, com Christopher Bollas, comentando Christopher Bollas, Histeria e Ânima em Bollas e Jung. Bom, é um pensador contundente, muito bem articulado, profícuo, uma produção incessante. Greg, um grande prazer te receber. Há muito tempo que eu queria te trazer para o Tiaços. Que bom que nós conseguimos arrumar uma data. Sinta-se muito bem-vindo. Prazer te receber. A palavra é sua.
Well, thank you, Marcus, for that warm introduction. Very happy to be presenting to you all today. So we're coordinating a little bit. We've had a little problem with the share screen, so I have my document here, and I'm just going to bring it up for me, and we'll kind of work through it. Now, my hope is to I've got a careful PowerPoint presentation, developing the ideas systematically. So I'll just go slowly over these and maybe read some of them twice even. And then we'll have some questions. So there's an alchemical etching from, I think it's in Jung's Psychology and Alchemy book. But you'll see it's an inspiring picture for this presentation with the old king and the wolf eating into its side, and then the king coming out of the fire, kind of a sublimated king. And we'll return to this at the end of the presentation, and I hope we'll have more insight into it through this picture. But my presentation is kind of contained in this picture. And just as I look at it now, I'm thinking about how when we we ask somebody, is something eating at you? Is something eating you? Or there's an American film called What's Eating Gilbert Grape? Something's gnawing at us, a doubt, a symptom, a negation. Okay, so slide 2, please. In this presentation, I will be sharing some passages from various authors that readily convey the central thrust of psychology as the discipline of interiority. While many of these will be familiar, they're being set alongside each other, read in the light of one another, allows us to partake in the further accentuating of their pertinence with respect to a psychology with soul. You'll remember that Jung stressed that his psychology was a psychology with soul. So third slide. I start with a passage from Jung. Problems draw us into an orphaned and isolated state where we are abandoned by nature and are driven to consciousness. There is no other way open to us. We are forced to resort to conscious decision and solutions where formerly we trusted ourselves to natural happenings. Every problem, therefore, brings the possibility of widening consciousness, but also the necessity of saying goodbye to childlike unconsciousness and trust in nature. So I'll just give you a moment to read that over for yourselves. And we can now move to slide 4. Cited in our context, this passage has to do with what we call negation on the one hand and the psychological difference on the other. The problems which arise in our lives and that we sometimes go to therapy to come to terms with can be conceived of as so many negations. Slide 5. Negation is a matter of positions that have been taken, assumptions and beliefs that have been held, no longer holding up, but rather showing themselves to be self-contradictory. Ass over tea kettle, head over heels. Our views and positions, if we don't simply retreat and tighten up against their negation, fall forward into themselves, somersault into new revised conceptions as a function of our having to realize that things are not as we had thought them to be. So there's a little English idiom, ass over tea kettle, which really means head over heels. Our views and positions, if we don't simply retreat and tighten up against their negation, fall forward into themselves, somersaulting into new revised conceptions as a function of our having to realize that things are not what we had thought them to be. Slide 6, please. We can think in this connection of the negating cut that in rites of passage were given to those being initiated into adulthood. Such cuts, as Giegerick has commented, impart to the one being initiated the insight that life is not what he or she had childishly wished it was or wanted it to be, but what it is. We need to approach problems in this way too, as if they were cuts by which consciousness is initiated into more thoughtful, more comprehensive determinations of itself. So in initiation rites, the young initiate is often given a cut, or I think in some Catholic confirmations, a slap in the face. And it kind of conveys the idea that we think that life isn't what you want it to be, it's not what you wish it was, it's what it is. And that's part of initiation into adulthood. And just as a side note, I'm just thinking as I read this to you of teenagers, young people who cut themselves. We often empathize with their feelings, and we have interpretations of that in terms of giving themselves some pain to objectify their emotion. But it's interesting to put it against this archetypal background as well of the initiatory cut that the coddled children of today are not being given. Slide 7. Consciousness becomes self-consciousness by becoming aware of its contradictions. In knowing its limits, it to that extent transcends them. As Jung put it in a letter, this is slide 8, please. As Jung puts it, if a man is contradicted by himself and knows that he contradicts himself, he is individuated. If a man is contradicted by himself and knows that he contradicts himself, he is individuated. I mean, that goes nicely with Jung's idea of the compensatory relationship to the unconscious. All these compensations would be kind of negations. As we expose ourselves to those negations, our attitude is enlarged. We kind of sublate them. Next slide, please. Slide 9. And this is from the poet Rilke, from a letter, I believe. Winning does not tempt that man. This is how he grows, by being defeated decisively by constantly greater beings. Winning does not tempt that man. This is how he grows, by being defeated decisively by constantly greater beings. As I read that, it just pops to my mind to remember a passage I quoted a lot in my writings from Jung's Concerning Rebirth, where he talks about how at the summits or the turning points of life, he says, the bud unfolds, and from the lesser, the greater emerges, the greater personality. St. Paul meets Christ on the road to Damascus. And then Jung says, he who is truly and hopelessly little will always drag the revelation of the greater down to the level of his littleness, and one will not know that the level of his littleness, that the day of judgment for his littleness has dawned. But he who is inwardly great will know that, that the larger personality has come and will flow into the greater. So it's nice to kind of amplify these quotes with comparisons, eh? So winning does not tempt that man. This is how he grows, by being defeated, negated, decisively by constantly greater beings. Okay, we can go to the next slide is number 10, please. This is a quote that Jung had. It's from Jung's Ion in volume 9, part 2, Ion. And this is from Mononymous, who Jung quotes. Seek him from out thyself. We're talking about God here. Seek him from out thyself, and learn who it is that taketh possession of everything in thee, saying, my God, my spirit, my understanding, my soul, my body. And learn whence is sorrow and joy, love and hate, and waking though one would not, and sleeping though one would not, and getting angry though one would not, and falling in love though one would not. And if thou shouldst closely investigate these things, thou wilt find him in thyself, the one and the many, like to that little point. For it is in thee that he has his origin and his deliverance. So seek him from out thyself. In all these things that happen to me against my will, in all these negations, in sorrow and joy, love and hate, insomnia, waking though one would not, sleeping, narcolepsy, sleeping though one would not, getting angry though one would not, all these things that happen to us. And if you would investigate these things, you will find him in thyself. So those are negating symptoms, mediating the divine. So slide number 11, please. So the psychological difference is a core concept of psychology. It's the discipline of interiority, or as I sometimes say, PDI. Turning now to what we call in PDI the psychological difference. This is the difference between man and soul, and also the difference between the innocently psychic and the reflectively psychological. You know, the psychic would be like images, dream images, emotions, you know, psychic states that you can point at. And the psychological would be when you apply them to themselves and you think them, you interiorize them into themselves. A dream is psychic, its interpretation is psychological. That's kind of the psychological difference. The psychological difference can be discerned in our earlier quotation from Jung. There is the difference between our merely trusting ourselves to nature on the one hand, and our being compelled when this trust is broken to reflect and make decisions on our own responsibility on the other. So the basic distinction for the psychological differences between man and soul, or between the psychic and the psychological. But there's many ways to conceptualize that difference. You know, for Jung, the difference between personalistic psychology and archetypal psychology would be another example, or the point of view of the ego and the point of view of the soul. These are all ways to convey or think the psychological difference. So slide number 12. So we now have two important terms in play: negation and the psychological difference. With our quote from Jung in mind, let us now add some additional references from other authors, which, when read in relation to one another, serve to bring to light what I like to call psychology's skyhook. I don't know how well that translates into Portuguese, but if you think of shepherds have a shepherd's crook, and if you could catch the sky with your shepherd's crook, with your shepherd's hook, but let that be invisible, a speculative skyhook. Another hint about what I'm getting at there is Jung sometimes talks about what he calls interpretation from above, not interpretation from below, reductively, but sometimes interpretation from above. Psychology's skyhook. Slide 13, please. We heard from Jung that problems negate our childlike trust in nature and force us to make conscious decisions. Orphaned by difficult circumstances, or simply by the negating principle that if anything can go wrong, it will go wrong, we have to think, to live by our wits, make the decisions through which we establish ourselves as the self-determining subjects, which is also to say, as I. Okay, go to slide 14 now. In the context of a conversation with an interlocutor who disagrees with his likening the world in general, and Denmark in particular, to a prison, Shakespeare's Hamlet insightfully declares, "Why then, it is none to you, not the prison to you that it is to me. For there is nothing either good nor bad, but thinking makes it so." So that's the phrase I wanted to put here. There's nothing either good nor bad, but thinking makes it so. This line from Shakespeare is most pertinent to our kind of cognitive psychology. Nothing is either good nor bad, except thinking makes it so. Putting this in terms of our psychology, we can say in agreement with this, that all perception is apperception, or again, that everything is sublated from the outset. That's a sentence you'll find in Gigerik's The Soul's Logical Life. Things are sublated from the outset. It would be like saying that, we could have a feeling or emotion. We could think that's very raw or whatever, but it's already scripted. It's already in the narrative of our language game. It's sublated from the outset. We have all kinds of feelings and emotional states that are psychic, but they're in a way already psychological. They're already given with the narratives we live in, the culture we live in, and they're already psychological. Okay. So by this, I mean that everything is a function of already prevailing, but perhaps yet to be made explicit concept we exist as. So this is an important idea to get to. There's me and the concept I exist as. And the concept would be my truth. Sometimes young people have to lag behind the truth that they are now independent adults. They exist as adult, but they may lag behind that. Or sometimes a university student could still be very much an immature adolescent, not doing their work, not doing their schoolwork, and they could lag behind the truth that they exist as a student. That's the concept. That's their truth of being at school and at university, even though they go to the school psychologist and try to get an exemption for all kinds of reasons that they didn't do their work or remember all kinds of anxieties and excuses, right? But the concept they exist as is they're a student, and they could lag behind that and could be making all kinds of phony psychological complaints. That's me being hard-nosed, I guess. Slide 16. Taking this a little further, in light of the version of the psychological difference that our adage from Shakespeare implies, we could say that whereas good and bad correspond to the existential concerns and valuations of the survival and prestige-oriented ego, the thinking that these, when more deeply comprehended, are relativized and superseded by, corresponds to the soul. I'll read that again. Taking this a little further, in light of the version of the psychological difference that our adage from Shakespeare implies, we could say that whereas good and bad correspond to the existential concerns and valuations of the survival and prestige-oriented ego, the thinking that these, when more deeply comprehended, are relativized and supervised, corresponds to the soul. So there we see in that contrast the psychological difference, ego and soul. So slide 17, please. In the course of our lives, we are constantly challenged by problems. Negations are ubiquitous, a regular feature of our existence. In other lines of the same play, Shakespeare refers to the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, the thousand natural shocks which flesh is heir to, the whips and scorns of time, the oppressor's wrong, and to the pangs of despised love. I've made for myself a long list of negations when I hear them in novels or in poetry or in film. I love to develop the poetics of my ear to hear all these negations. And here's one here, Bob Dylan. Everybody Must Get Stoned, that song can be cited in connection. Here we're on slide 18, please. May also be cited in connection to our theme of negation. And Dylan sings, well, they'll stone you when you're trying to be so good. They'll stone you just like they said they should. They'll stone you when you're trying to go home, and they'll stone you when you're there all alone. But I would not feel so all alone. Everybody must get stoned. And on through all the verses of that song. Under the heading of negation, we're on slide 19 now, please. Under the heading of negation, we can include symptoms, problems, fiascos, cuts, woundings, traumas, anxieties, breakdowns, depressions, bad moods, Freudian slips, accidents. We could also add falling in love. Also, differences of any kind are negations. Critical feedback, the viewpoint of other people that is different, challenging to our own. These are all negations. The mind, the soul, however, this is slide 20, please. The mind, the soul, however, is always already over-grasping what would otherwise be merely a negation-mediating external happening. Let me start that again. The mind, the soul, however, always already over-grasping what would otherwise be merely a negation-mediating external happening, so blatantly gives rise to itself by allowing itself to be taught by such negations how to think in a more comprehensive, i.e., anomaly inclusive spirit. We can go to 21 now, please. Slide 21. This is the saying, very much part of English idiom. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. We have to learn to hear this adage in all manner of situations as a statement of the soul about itself. That line is constantly with me in my work as a therapist. People are talking about the slings and arrows and the things that have happened in their lives, but they become sadder and wiser through talking about these things and debriefing them. And then I think they get better when they take responsibility for what's happened to them by becoming wise. And so, fool me once, shame on you, world or husband or wife, but fool me twice, shame on me. Slide 22. And in keeping with this, we also need to understand that the not of negation, in the previous slide, the not of being fooled or taught a lesson by some life event, is not something separate from, external to one's initial position or initial stance. Indeed, despite its at first seeming to come from outside, negation is rather the realization that the matter has all along not been what it had seemed to be. And this is at once the first immediacy of the recognition or recognition of the new form of the matter. So so for sure, lots of shit happens, negations happen from outside. That's the ordinary view. But as therapists, analysts, we're wanting to listen to these things also as self-negation, because my spouse may have left me, but I'm also being taught a lesson that life's like that. This is what life is like, and my consciousness has to become adequate to life and learn from life. So what seems like an external negation can be conceptualized as an internal self-negation. We're no longer naive after we integrate the negation. Okay. So I really wanted to get across the idea that when we talk about negation, we're not talking about something that comes from outside. We're talking about the self-negation of the attitude one had. And so it's self-negation, even though it's mediated often by what seems like an external negation or is an external negation. But psychologically, we try to think about it as a self-negation, that one was naive and one is taught better by life, taught otherwise. Slide 23. The Jesus of the Christian Apocrypha's Acts of John declares, "You hear that I suffered, yet I suffered not, and that I suffered not, yet I did suffer, and that I was pierced, yet I was not wounded, that I was hanged, yet I was not hanged, that blood flowed for me, yet it did not flow. And in a word, what they say of me, I did not endure, and what they do not say, those things I did suffer. Now what these are, I secretly show you. You must know me then as the torment of the Logos, the piercing of the Logos, the blood of the Logos, the wounding of the Logos, the fastening of the Logos." So a wonderful passage there. There's the psychological difference between the first sense of suffering and the second sense of suffering. So let's go to slide 24. Earlier, I defined the psychological difference as the difference between the ego and the soul, or again, as the difference between the psychic and the psychological. In the statement attributed to Christ in the previous slide, the psychological difference is once again distinguished. This time it's the difference between empirical suffering on the one hand and the logos that is capable of suffering on the other. I would claim the second sense of suffering to correspond to what we mean when we say the truth hurts, or again, when we suffer from a sense of injustice or are troubled by our ideals and values having been offended. The suffering of the Logos. Okay, so slide 25, please. Now, it is important not to construe what I just referred to as the empirical and the logical as falling outside one another in an external relation. Continuing a tradition that can be traced back through Hegel and Aristotle to Parmenides in his great statement, "Thinking and being are the same," we should rather regard the logical as being the truth of the empirical, even as the empirical is the realness of the logical ideational. Okay, so we should rather think of thinking and being are the same. We should rather regard the logical as being the truth or the depth of the empirical, even as the empirical is the realness of the logical ideational. So slide 26, please. Illustrative of this often uneasy and self-contradictory unity of thinking and being are those times when it becomes necessary to question whether the names we think with are in accord with the things or situations they are supposed to define, or the other way around, if things and situations are in accord with their concepts. Time and again, we find that once apt names have only the truthless character of labels pasted on, or that once fitting labels are peeling away. Sensing this, we give the labels a pull, and lo and behold, it is as if not only the labels are being pulled off, but the rug pulled out from beneath the things and situations we thought we knew, such that these are plunged into non-identity with themselves. We and they into a process of transforming redefinition. New names are then required that are commensurate with new times. I think it's really important to think of transformation as a matter of redefinition, of what we had taken to be true, showing itself to be contradictory, no longer true, and we're being driven by that into a redefinition. And I'll just say here as an aside that when I talk about true, and in PDI, in psychology as the discipline of interiority, when we talk about truth, one way we don't really mean true versus false. That's not what true is about for us. It's more like whether something corresponds with its concept. So for instance, when you say, let's say you have an experience of friendship with your friend, and that says, he's a true friend. Some wonderful thing happened in friendship, or one is betrayed by one's friend. He is not a friend. So does something correspond with its concept, or weighed up? Does it not? So that's kind of what we mean by truth. Does it correspond to its concept? And sometimes negations drive us into a more acute concept, into a redefinition of the concept. Okay, so let's go to the next slide, which is 27. So this is from the English romantic poet, philosopher, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Beautiful quote. He says, "Truths of all others, the most awful and mysterious, yet being at the same time of universal interest, are too often considered as so true that they lose all the life and efficiency of truth and lie bedridden in the dormitory of the soul, side by side with the most despised and exploded of errors." I think it's Shelley, talks about truth being blunted by reiteration. It can lose its sheen and need to be kind of rediscovered. So truth of all others, the most awful and mysterious, yet being at the same time of universal interest, are too often considered as so true that they lose all the life and efficiency of truth and lie bedridden in the dormitory of the soul, side by side with the most despised and exploded errors. And when this is the case, when a truth becomes old hat, it's kind of ripe for ironization, ripe for negation, I would add. So we can go to slide 28. We began with Jung's statement about how problems negate, or more strictly speaking, reflect the self-negation of the childlike innocence of the merely natural man, and open up the psychological difference by compelling us to make the decisions that establish and actualize a wider consciousness. This I then set alongside Shakespeare's statement that nothing is either good nor bad, but thinking makes it so. Leaving these opposites, good and bad, behind, since their difference one from the other is surpassed by the relativizing insight that it is thinking that makes them so, I want now to move on to some subtler articulations of the thinking mind's dialectic of negation. So 29, slide 29, please. Jung liked to cite the adage of Goethe, "The good is always the enemy of the better." Hegel's dialectic of self-negating logical movement is well conveyed in this line. In Hegelian dialectics, any position, if rigorously applied to itself, may be shown to fall short of itself, to contradict itself, and need to be formulated again in light of this experience. Every position eventually succumbs to its version of the curiosity that killed the cat. And this is so even with respect to the conclusions we may have drawn, goals we may have reached. Dialectics, in the sense we've learned something of from Hegel, is again and again the realizations that the positions we take and the conclusions we have drawn are but a halfway house from which our thinking has to push off once more. That's from Walter Kaufmann, who wrote a book about Hegel. He explains Hegel's dialectic in terms of this analogy to a halfway house. Every time you work something out or get to a position or get to a result, then you'll find it negates itself, that it's only a halfway house, that I've still got further to go. It undermines itself and has to get a finer point put on it. So we can go to slide 30. Putting Hegel's dialectical method in a nutshell, the Hegel scholar J.N. Findley writes, "The action of thought is to negate the basis from which it starts, to show it up as not being self-subsistent, and so to have in it a springboard from which it can ascend to what is truly self-subsistent and self-explanatory. I'll read that again, it's precious. The action of thought is to negate the basis from which it starts, to show it up as not being self-subsistent, and so to have in it a springboard from which it can ascend to what is truly self-subsistent and self-explanatory. What a contrast this to what passes for thinking in so much of psychology. Most psychologists cling to some life phenomena as their base and reduce the psyche to this. We have only to think of Freud's reducing the soul to biology and sex. And of course, today there's the whole craze of conflating psychology with brain science. Okay, we can go to slide 31. The more speculative mode of thought of a truly psychological psychology, by contrast, proceeds, as Findlay puts it, by negating the basis from which it is purported to start on an interpretive occasion. It proceeds via a self-negating action of pulling the carpet out from beneath itself, much as Freud did when he rejected the seduction theory. I've written about this. I think I write about it in one of my chapters in dialectics and analytical psychology. But that's important in our own history. Remember that Freud believed that hysteria was, first believed it was based on sexual abuse, seduction. And then he had to realize he didn't deny that sexual abuse happens, but he came to doubt that all hysteria, there's so much hysteria in the population that it can't all be explained by this material cause of an external trauma, sexual trauma. So he came to doubt that, and then then he got to the idea of the power of fantasy. So he got to psychic reality. So he pulled the rug out from under his theory, his first theory of hysteria. He pulled the rug out from under that and got to a more subtle notion of the role that fantasy plays and how in that disturbance. So there's an early example of a self-negation, or pulling the rug out from underneath in Freud. We can go on to slide 32. Now, the point to be grasped is that negation has an upshot, a vertical trajectory. Consciousness becomes conscious of itself. The soul comes home to itself by finding fault with what it initially seemed to be or to be based upon. And it is in this way, by becoming subject in a way that no longer needs to be contrasted to an object other than itself, that the soul asserts its self-subsistence. It's the same dialectical process that Jung spoke of when he wrote of problems making it impossible for us to just go along with the natural course of life and forcing us to become conscious and to think. When confronted by the negating challenge of a problem, a person or a people are compelled to think, what will we do now? Go to slide 33. The negations we are subject to in the course of life hold our feet to the fire. What will I do? We are each forced to ask. And ask this not merely because this, that, or the other thing has happened externally, but because coming into my own as the negation of such outwardly mediated negations, I am determined above all to be myself. As Jung, asking a similar question, once put it, who am I that all this should happen to me? That line from Jung comes from Psychology and Alchemy. And I'll just remind you that he's dealing with the dream of the dreamer who finds himself on a train platform with his parents and his family. And Jung says he's regressed, he's unraveled back into the family, where he had integrated his personality and now he's unraveled back into the family. And you can blame the mother for this and the father for that. But he who is truly adult will ask himself, who am I that all this should happen to me? So they're moving from the psychology of blame to the psychology of self-negation and responsibility. Who am I that all this should happen to me? Slide 34. What I just said about the role negation plays in the production of the I, the soul as I, applies as well to that other subject, psychology itself, the psychological I. You know, we can think of psychology as a subject, just like you might think of the law as a subject, right? I can go to court about something, have experiences in court as somebody who's got a court action against them. But the law also experiences itself and sets new precedents. So the law is a subject too, that drives itself into new determinations of itself. The concept of justice evolves. The law evolves, capital L. So likewise, there's us in psychology as patient or therapist, but there's psychology itself, the discipline, and the soul as psychology, the psychological I. So what I just said about the role negation plays in the production of the I applies as well to that other subject, psychology itself, the psychological I. Just as on the personal level, we expose ourselves to whatever our situation may be, while giving voice at the same time to our truth as the persons we thereby become, so too is psychology an acute form of subjectivity that comes into its own, into its absolute subjectivity as what we call the soul, by pushing off from external foundations, which is also to say, as the negation of all that it is not. 35. Slide 35, please. So here's this word sublation or sublate. And sublation is to negate something, but also to retain it and to bring it to include it in a higher understanding or a higher determination. But here's another way of talking about sublation that you'll find in Hegel. To sublate and the sublated. These constitute one of the most important notions in philosophy. It is a fundamental determination which repeatedly occurs through the whole of philosophy, and the meaning of which is to be clearly grasped and especially distinguished from nothing. We're talking about negation. We're talking about something being made null or nothing. What is sublated is not thereby reduced to nothing. Nothing is immediate. What is sublated, on the other hand, is the result of mediation. It is a non-being, but as a result which has its origin in a being. It still has, therefore, in itself the determination from which it originates. So I'm negated, but I survive, and in the result of my negation, or a position is, right? So negation is not nothing. It's a subtle thing that comes as the result of something, of what used to be, right? It's a ghostly continuation or spirit there, right? Zizek puts it well. I think he has a book called, Less Than Nothing. Less than nothing. It's not a something, but it's less and more. It's subtle. I'm struggling for analogies. In homeopathy, they have the water with something in it, some tincture of some flower in it. They dilute it so many times that chemistry can't find anything of the flower fragrance in it anymore. But somehow it's imparted its essence or its spirit to the water, and so it's nothing, but it's not nothing. It's the result of something that used to be. So it had its origin of being, right? That's been negated and sublated. Let's go to 36. Pertinent in this connection is Giegerich's description of the baselessness of psychology. In the first volume of his collected English papers, there's an article called Jungian Psychology, a Baseless Enterprise, right? He means bottomless, baseless, okay? So pertinent in this connection is Giegerich's description of the baselessness of Jung's psychology. It's baselessness in the sense of it's not being based upon a more literal or positively existing substrate. So we're on slide 36. So Jung was able to think, this is Giegerich from The Soul's Logical Life. Jung was able to think the notion soul, which means to experience life, all the various phenomena of life through this one thought as his lens. In everything he experienced, he was being able to hold his place in the notion soul. This one thought was binding for all his psychological work. He did not allow the inherent pull of phenomena to seduce him into looking at them in the light of the perspectives they might suggest. In view of sexuality, for instance, he did not step out of the notion soul in favor of obvious ideas like body and biology. And with respect to psychological life in general, he did not resort to sexual libido, nor to desire or family romance. Neurotic disorders did not seduce him to escape to the idea of causes. The phenomenon of transference did not make him take refuge in the idea of object relations, and so on. He remained faithful to his one thought, the notion of soul. This made him a psychologist. So no substrate, nothing more literal that he based his psychology on. You can all look that up for yourself on page 43. It's a precious statement. Slide 37. What Giegerich refers to as Jung's ability to hold himself in the notion soul brings to mind a beautiful passage from Nietzsche titled, "And Once More Grow Clear." In this passage, the philosopher conveys to his readers a sense of the living reality of the soul by comparing himself and his readers with him to an open fountain which would hinder no one from drinking from it. Like an open fountain, however, Nietzsche and we as readers have no means from preventing ourselves being made turbid and dark by passers-by, no means of preventing the age in which we live casting its up-to-date rubbish into us, or hindering filthy birds throwing their excrement, the boys their trash, the fatigued resting travelers their misery, great and small, into us. But we do as we have always done. We take whatever is cast into us down into our depths, for we are deep. We do not forget, and once more grow clear. This is also a fountain. So move to 38, please. Giegerich writes, psychology happens when there is a mind that while looking into the inner or outer world is able to stay within itself, within the mind and its notion, not within the private subjectivity of the person's fantasies or feelings, but within the notion of soul. It must be able to relentlessly hold its place in the bottomlessness and infinity of the black hole that its constitutive internal identity is. And that is the soul of psychology equals the notion of soul. And to see whatever there is to be seen, external facts, as well as facts known through introspection, include exclusively within the confines of this mirror. Now, again, to help you with that, I'll just make the comparison to the law, right? You know, there is, Gingrich is here saying that psychology is a notional practice. Its core notion is the notion soul. It thinks that notion, right? And in the law, there's the notion, law is also a notional field, a notional practice. Its notion is justice. And so people are rooted in the notion of justice. The judge is blind. The judge doesn't know anything about anything. Expert witnesses come before him and talk about what's the psychic or life phenomena, but he's just trying to reflect it in the notion of justice, right? To weigh things against themselves in the mirror of the notion of justice. So there's a connection between the judicial difference and the psychological difference. And the law is a notional practice with justice. Psychology is a notional practice with soul as the notion we're rooted in, the root of our analytic attitude. To move on to 39. The question arises, if psychology is as much like the fountain Nietzsche described as it is like the bottomless black hole that Gingrich speaks of, and if, moreover, as we heard from Findlay, it is also characterized by the fact that the action of thought is to negate the basis for which it starts, to show it up as not being self-subsistent, and so as to have in it a springboard from which it can ascend to what is truly self-subsistent and self-explanatory. What makes for an analytic attitude that, in keeping with this, is truly psychological? Slide 40. Negative capability. Pinpointed the quality that makes for persons of great achievement in literature, and this is a quality that he regards Shakespeare as having possessed enormously, the English Romantic poet John Keats wrote in a letter of what he called negative capability. By negative capability, Keats meant an attitude of mind that can begin uncertainties, mysteries, and doubts without an irritable reaching after fact and reason. Negative capability, the ability to be in uncertainties, mysteries, and doubts without an irritable reaching after fact and reason. Similarly, Jung says, all I know comes from my mastery of unknowing, or it was beyond, was drawing on the same passage from Keats when he said he started every session without memory or desire. That kind of thing. Okay, we can move on to 41. Now, the attitude of the psychologist must also be negatively capable. It too must be able to be in uncertainties, mysteries, and doubts without an irritable reaching after fact and reason, so that the topic of interest or phenomena at hand can think itself out through him. I should add to this, we should be able to be in mysteries without an irritable reaching after fact and reason, or without an irritable reaching out for something more literal, something without an irritable reaching out for a substrate. To reify, to make everything about attachment theory, or that reductive tendency to something more literal. And so we want to push off from that, having a literal base. Get that also in Hillman, who stressed so much deliteralizing, right? So let's move on to 42. The point to be grasped is that the negations of life, if not tightened up against, but regarded as providing a critique of consciousness, i.e. of the thinking that makes things so, conducts to this attitude. Okay. Illustrative of this is a dream. We're on slide 43. Illustrative of this is a dream that seems to be about the initiation into such an attitude. A dreamer dreams that he is writing down an important statement. However, as he gets to the end of the sentence, he sees that the words he has written are just as quickly fading from the page. He is writing with disappearing ink. Again, he tries to write the sentence down, again and again, but each time, and to his considerable consternation, he sees that the ink won't take and the statement fades and disappears. But then, and with this, the dream comes to its climax. He is awed and astonished to realize that though the statement resists being written down, the paper he is writing on has become of finer and finer quality until it's just exquisite, expensive grade paper. So there's negation and sublation happening. For those of you who have read some of my writings about drawing on Hegel's speculative sentence, there's a connection here as well to the speculative sentence. Let's go to 44, slide 44. In his novel, Lord Jim, Joseph Conrad well conveys the negation-mediated subtlety of mind that I'm claiming to be indicative of a truly psychological attitude when he writes, "A man that is born falls into a dream like a man who falls into the sea. If he tries to climb out into the air, as inexperienced people endeavor to do, he drowns. No, I tell you, the way is to the destructive elements submit yourself, and with the exertions of your hands and feet in the water, make the deep, deep sea keep you up." So I'll give you that again. A man that is born falls into a dream like a man who falls into the sea. If he tries to climb out into the air, as inexperienced people endeavor to do, he drowns. No, I tell you, the way is to the destructive elements submit yourself. With the exertions of your hands and feet in the water, make the deep, deep sea keep you up. Slide 45, please. Another example. Two actors are describing their craft. One likens acting to walking on a tightrope without a net. We may suppose him to be characterizing the risks of the risks that an actor must take in acting. He's got to stake himself and make risks. So walking on a tightrope is like acting is like walking on a tightrope without a net. But taking this analogy a step further, or as we say, interiorizing it into itself, the other actor then adds that it is not only without a rope, it is not only without a net that one steps out into the air, but also without the tightrope either. Slide 46. In ordinary conversation, dialectical thinking is performed whenever someone puts a finer point on what has just been said, and this in a way that, through irony perhaps, makes what was still implicit in the previous formulation more explicit. From John Keats's poem, Keats says, "Heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter. Therefore, ye soft pipes, play on, not to the sensual ear, but more endeared, pipe to the spirit ditties of no tone." So listening, as analysts, we listen with the third ear, we say. We read between the lines. Or St. Paul says, the letter killeth, but the spirit giveth life. All of that. So 48, slide 48, please. We're getting close to the end here. Summary of our figures of negation thus far. Thought negating its own base in a bid to ascend to its self-sustaining truth. Writing with disappearing ink over paper that becomes finer and finer in the course of these reiterated negations of the intended statement. The actor without a net or a tightrope stepping out into the theatrical element. The Grecian urn of Keats's poem, piping to the spirit ditties of no tone. To this list, I want to tack on a statement of Jung's. And another formulation of what we call the psychological difference. Jung aptly conveys the negative subtlety of the soul side of that difference when he states that in psychological discourse, in psychology, we are not saying anything about the psyche, but the psyche is always speaking about itself. So in psychological discourse, we are not saying anything about the psyche, but the psyche is always speaking about itself. You get this a lot in Hillman as well. In revisioning psychology, talks extensively about how psychological theories are fantasy productions of the psyche, right? They are also archetypal. So we are not saying anything about the psyche, but the psyche is always speaking about itself. Or in Giegerick, in psychology, we're in the world of theory all the time. Theories about theories about theories, interpretations of interpretations of interpretations. No positive base, no substrate. So slide 49, please. The point to be grasped is that we cannot positively say what the soul is, but must let the negations of what we at first assume it to be teach us time and again what it means. The point to be grasped is that we cannot positively say what the soul is, but must let the negations of what we at first assume it to be teach us time and again what it is or means. Slide 50. Giegerick writes, "It seems to me that as long as we approach psychic phenomena with specific ideas of what soul is in the back of our mind, with a more or less fixed meaning of soulful and soulless, then we operate with subjective prejudgment. We only do full justice to the concept of the objective psyche if we grant the prime matter itself, each prime matter, to have everything within itself that it needs, even its own definition of soul. We must not bring our sense of soul to the phenomena, but must conversely let them teach us what soul means, in each case anew, in each concrete context." Next slide, 51. Thus, we should not derive fixed meanings for the term soul or timeless categories, the gods, for psychology from one particular cultural phase in the soul's life. For example, Greek myth viewed through late Platonic lenses. That was valid then, but not now. The soul itself decides what and how it is at each historical time, not we. The soul is alive and it is life. It is free time and again to reinvent itself in the course of its history. Such an attitude allows one to see the soul even in the archaic phenomena of blood sacrifice and in modern technological civilization, both of which might otherwise appear as soulless. And conversely, it does not allow one to speak of Zeus or Aphrodite in the context of modern life, as is sometimes done in archetypal psychology. Next slide, 52. The soul is always the soul of and in the real, and what at a given time has been via ejectum, thrown out, the despised. Psychologist's job is to free the soul, the spirit mercurius, imprisoned in the real. And to free the soul means in the last analysis, above all, to free the soul means in the last analysis, above all, to free along with it its own definition of itself. And so I believe that's from a letter Giegerick wrote to this seminar many years ago. And so let's go on to slide 53. Bearing in mind what we just learned from Giegerick, we can return to the alchemical picture I displayed at the outset. The wolf as prima materia devouring the king is illustrative of his point that each topic, phenomenon, or prime matter has within itself its own definition of soul. The process that brings this redefinition of soul to light, we could also say that brings this revelation of a new truth to light, involves the negating and sublating of the old definition, the old king. So slide 54. So there's that picture again, eh? So Jung writes, the wolf as prima materia devouring the dead king. In the background, sublimation and the prima materia, rebirth of the king. So that wolf is like any contradiction, any negation, any symptom, any cut. What's gnawing at you? What's gnawing at me? What's troubling me? What's pulling the rug out from under my, my doubt, the doubt that gnaws into me. And if I, and there's a whole idea of containing that in the alchemical vessel and driving it into a higher state of itself, a more subtle state of itself. And that's the king coming out of the fire there. That's the sublated redefinition. Okay, on to the next slide, 55. Well conveyed in the alchemical picture is the dialectical process in where the mind attains new status of itself by a process of negation and sublation. In the foreground of the picture, the reigning or existing concept, imaged as the king, is shown to be negated by a prime matter, something anomalous, symptomatic perhaps. He is a fallen king, and the inner discrepancy or contradiction that has occasioned this is tautologically outpictured as a wolf eating into his side. It is the famous recursive self-redefining Hegelian formula, A equals A plus not A. So it's not just A equals A, I'm self-identical, but there's A equals A plus the lump in my throat, plus my symptom, that, right? So it is the famous recursive and self-redefining Hegelian formula, A equals A and not A, by which the mind of a particular concept drives itself into new determinations of itself by taking to heart the contradictions to it. The king emerging from the flames higher up in the background of the picture represents the sublated or newly defined reigning concept. It's produced by the aforementioned negation having been tarried with to the point where it is itself negated and restored or newly defined position attained. And that would go on and on, we can imagine, to new levels. We can go on to the next slide, 56. I have just one final quotation to share. With our alchemical image of the negated and sublated king in mind, I want to end this presentation by citing a famous passage from Hegel's Phenomenology of the Spirit, which is most pertinent to my theme of negation's upshot. In Hegel's view, the life of the spirit is such that it wins its truth only when, in utter dismemberment, it finds itself. Continuing, he states, oops, let me just a second, I've got my wrong page here. Continuing, he states, it is this power, not as something positive, which closes its eyes to the negative, as when we say of something that it is nothing or is false, and then having done with it, turn away and pass on to something else. On the contrary, spirit is this power only by looking the negative in the face and tarrying with it. This tarrying with the negative is the magical power that converts it into being. So this is the important idea. It's tarrying with the negative. Giegerick defines truth somewhere as truth is the world as it really happens to be, plus the determined presence of man. We expose ourselves to what is and are taught by the way it cuts into us, how to think about it. So there's this important tarrying with the negative that leads to truth, being dismembered by what is, and that going through a process of redefinition. And slide 56. 7. I've finished my presentation, but I want to remember to make sure everybody knows about the publishing company that I started. It's a small affair just to bring books out of interest to people interested in psychology of the discipline interiority, and that's Dusk Owl Books, and that's the website address there. And if you go there, you can put your email in there and be on a waiting list to learn about new books, or you can check them out. But with that, I'm finished what I want to present, and we can have some questions.